The steady drip of chemotherapy wasn't what bothered me most that day. It was the call from my stepdaughter that shattered whatever composure I had left. I'd gotten used to the rhythmic beeping of machines and the antiseptic smell of the cancer ward, but Tessa's trembling voice hit differently. My name is Celeste, and until that moment, I thought I understood what betrayal meant. Mom, I need to tell you something about Dad, Tessa said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's not coming to your next treatment. He told me he has an important business meeting in Chicago. I gripped my phone tighter, watching the clear liquid flow through the 4-line into my arm. Sweetheart, it's okay. I've managed the last 3 sessions without him. No, it's not okay. The force of her words made me flinch. The meeting isn't in Chicago. I saw him yesterday at La Maison with some woman. They were intimate. The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright. A nurse passed by, giving me a concerned look, but I waved her off with what I hoped was a reassuring smile. Mom. Tessa's voice cracked. Are you there? I'm here, I said, surprising myself with how steady I sounded. Tell me what you saw. As Tessa described the scene, Victor leaning across the table, touching the woman's hand. Laughing in that way he used to laugh with me, I found myself focusing on the oddest detail. He'd taken her to La Maison, our restaurant, where he'd proposed to me 15 years ago. Her name is Sabrina, Tessa continued. She works in his department. She's maybe 35. I watched an elderly couple shuffle past my chair, the husband supporting his wife with gentle patience. Something twisted in my chest that had nothing to do with cancer. Mom, I have more to tell you, but not over the phone. Can I come see you tomorrow? Of course, I replied, my mind already racing ahead. Come early, before your father usually checks in. After hanging up, I sat there, letting the magnitude of it all sink in. Victor hadn't touched me since my diagnosis 3 months ago. He'd been busy with work, stressed about medical bills, tired from all the worry. Now I understood he'd been building his exit strategy while I was fighting for my life. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career as a financial analyst helping people protect their assets, yet here I was, possibly losing everything to a man who'd promised to love me in sickness and in health. I looked down at my wedding ring, twisting it around my finger. Tomorrow, Tessa would tell me more, but tonight I had planning to do. I couldn't sleep that night, so I did what any financial analyst would do. I started digging through our accounts. The blue light from my laptop illuminated our home office as memories flooded back, each one taking on a different meaning now. 3 months ago, right after my diagnosis, Victor had insisted I sign some paperwork. Just routine updates to our portfolio, he'd said, his hand resting heavily on my shoulder. You're not feeling well, let me handle this. I trusted him. After 15 years of marriage, why wouldn't I? My hands trembled as I logged into our joint account. The balance seemed normal at first glance, but something caught my eye, a series of small transfers to an unfamiliar account. Starting exactly 2 weeks after my first chemotherapy session. The doorknob rattled, and I quickly minimized the window. Victor appeared, his silk pajamas perfectly pressed even at midnight. Still up? He asked, leaning against the doorframe. You should be resting. Just checking some work emails. I lied, noting how he didn't move to embrace me like he used to. The office needs my input on the Henderson account. He frowned. You shouldn't be working during treatment. Let them handle it. His tone was caring, but his eyes were cold. Come to bed. In a minute. After he left, I pulled up the transfer records again. The pattern was clever, amounts small enough to avoid attention, spread out over weeks. I'd taught him that technique myself, years ago when we discussed tax optimization strategies. My phone buzzed with a text from Lyla. Coffee tomorrow? Need to talk. I replied yes, then sat back in my chair, remembering the day Victor and I bought this house. He'd been so different then, or maybe I'd been too blind to see. That day, he'd spun me around in what would become our kitchen, promising we'd build a beautiful life together. You're my rock, he'd said. My smart, beautiful rock. Now I understood. I wasn't his rock, I was his stepping stone. The next morning, I met Lyla at our usual cafe. She was already there, fidgeting with her cup sleeve. I saw something yesterday, she said without preamble. Victor was at the jewelry store on 5th. He was looking at engagement rings. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. Engagement rings? Lyla reached across the table, her hand warm on mine. There's more. The woman with him, Sabrina. She works in my building. She's been bragging about landing a wealthy, soon-to-be-divorced executive. I set my cup down carefully, watching the liquid ripple. Soon-to-be-divorced. Celeste, Lyla's voice softened. When was the last time you checked your medical power of attorney? The question hit me like a physical blow. Victor hadn't just been planning his exit, he'd been orchestrating my entire erasure. Tessa arrived at my house early the next morning, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't even taken off her coat before the words tumbled out. He invited me to dinner last night, she said, pacing my kitchen. With her. With Sabrina. Her voice cracked on the name. He wanted me to meet my new mother. The mug I was holding slipped from my fingers, shattering against the tile. Neither of us moved to clean it up. What did you say? I asked, gripping the counter to steady myself. I walked out. But Mom, there's worse. Tessa pulled out her phone, hands shaking. I recorded part of it. I had to. You need to hear this. Victor's voice filled my kitchen, smooth as aged whiskey. Once the treatment stopped working, Sabrina will step in as your new mother figure. Celeste knew this might happen. We discussed it after her diagnosis. She wants us to be happy. My legs gave out, and I sank into a kitchen chair. 15 years of marriage reduced to a contingency plan. He's already moved most of your joint assets, Tessa continued, her voice trembling. I overheard him on the phone with his lawyer. They're using your illness to justify it, claiming you're not competent to manage finances anymore. The morning sun streamed through my kitchen window, catching the shards of my broken mug. Each piece reflected light differently, like the fragments of my life scattering across the floor. There's more, Tessa said, sitting across from me. Sabrina works in medical insurance. She's been accessing your files, looking for ways to challenge your coverage. A strange calm settled over me. When did they start dating? 6 months ago. Tessa wouldn't meet my eyes. Before your diagnosis. The timeline clicked into place. Victor's late nights, his sudden interest in my health insurance, the way he'd insisted on handling all the paperwork after my diagnosis. He hadn't just abandoned me when I got sick, he'd been planning his exit long before. He's having dinner with her family tonight, Tessa added, to announce their engagement. I stood up, carefully stepping around the broken ceramic. Call Lyla, I said. Tell her to meet us at my office in an hour. What are you going to do? I opened my laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. Something I should have done 15 years ago. Protect myself. The screen showed our joint accounts, Victor's careful pattern of transfers, and the medical power of attorney he'd had me sign. He thought he was clever, using my own financial techniques against me. But he'd forgotten one crucial detail. I'd spent my career helping people protect their assets from people exactly like him. Mom. Tessa's voice was small. Are you okay? I looked up at my stepdaughter, seeing the worry in her eyes. No, I said honestly. But I will be. And so will you. Lyla's law office felt like neutral ground as we gathered around her conference table. The city skyline stretched behind us, a backdrop to the war council we'd assembled. My laptop displayed spreadsheets and account statements, the paper trail of Victor's betrayal. He's been methodical, Lyla said, reviewing the documents. Moving assets in small increments, changing beneficiaries, even accessing your medical records through Sabrina. It's thorough. Too thorough, I replied, pulling up another document. Look at the timestamps on these transfers. They started exactly 1 week before my first diagnostic test. Tessa leaned forward. But that would mean... He knew, I finished. Somehow he knew about my cancer before I did. The room went silent. Lyla's face hardened as she pulled out her phone, dialing quickly. After a brief conversation, she set it down. Sabrina worked in records at your hospital before moving to insurance, she said. She would have seen your test results come through. My hands started shaking, but not from weakness. They've been planning this for months, using my illness as cover. There's something else, Tessa said quietly, sliding her phone across the table. Dad's company is launching a new medical technology division. The announcement goes public next week. Guess who's listed as the incoming CEO? The press release showed Victor and Sabrina, smiling professionally. The caption praised her background in medical administration and insurance, perfect credentials for leading a healthcare venture. He's not just replacing me, I said, the pieces clicking together. He's building an entirely new life. One where my death becomes a stepping stone to his success story. Lyla started to speak, but her office door opened. Her assistant rushed in, looking flustered. Mrs. Marlin, your husband is in the lobby. He's demanding to see you. Through the glass walls, I could see Victor's reflection in the elevator doors, straightening his tie. Always image-conscious, even when destroying lives. Perfect timing, I said, closing my laptop. Tessa, remember what we discussed? She nodded, already pulling out her phone. Recording everything. Lyla. My friend smiled grimly. Documents are ready. Just say the word. I stood, smoothing my shirt, the same one I'd worn to chemotherapy yesterday. Let him see what he was trying to erase. Send him up, I told the assistant. It's time Victor learned that terminal illness doesn't mean terminal weakness. As we waited for the elevator to arrive, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked different somehow, stronger, despite everything. Victor thought he was orchestrating my exit. Instead, he'd given me something unexpected, the clarity to see who I really was without him. The elevator dinged. Game on. Victor strode into Lyla's office like he owned it, his confidence faltering only slightly when he saw all three of us waiting. His eyes narrowed at the papers spread across the conference table. Family meeting? He asked, trying to sound casual. You should have told me, darling. I would have brought Sabrina. Funny you mention her, I said, sliding a document toward him. She's been quite busy at the hospital. His face flickered, just for a moment, before his mask slipped back into place. I don't know what you're implying. HIPAA violations are serious, Victor. So is insider trading. I tapped another document, especially when they're connected to a new medical technology division. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. You're not thinking clearly. The treatments must be affecting your judgment. That's your go-to move, isn't it? Tessa spoke up, her voice trembling with anger. Gaslighting mom while you build your perfect new life? Victor's charm vanished. Stay out of this, Tessa. This is between adults. Actually, Lyla interjected, as Celeste's legal counsel, I'd say this involves everyone you've manipulated. His composure cracked. Legal counsel? Celeste, you're sick. You need rest, not lawyers. I stood up slowly, steadying myself against the table. I am sick, Victor, but not in the way you hoped. What does that mean? My latest scans, I said, pulling out one final document. The treatment's working. I'm responding better than expected. Your timeline just got complicated, didn't it? The color drained from his face. Behind him, Tessa's phone kept recording. You have two options, I continued. We can do this quietly. You transfer back the assets you moved, resign from the company before the scandal breaks, and we handle the divorce discreetly. Or what? He spat the words. Or I let the SEC investigate how you and your new CEO acquired inside information about medical technology companies. I'm sure they'd be very interested in Sabrina's access to patient data. Victor slammed his hands on the table. You wouldn't dare. You'll destroy everything, including your own reputation. No, Victor. You already did that when you decided my death would make a convenient corporate origin story. He straightened his tie, a nervous tic I'd noticed years ago. You're bluffing. You don't have proof. I smiled, thinking of the recordings, documents, and witnesses we'd gathered. Want to bet your future on that? The silence stretched between us like a rubber band about to snap. Finally, Victor reached for the settlement papers. I'll have my lawyer review these, he said stiffly. Today, I replied. Or tomorrow, I start making calls. As he stormed out, Tessa stopped recording and hugged me. I was shaking, but not from weakness. Mom, she whispered. Are you really getting better? I held her tighter. Yes, in more ways than one. 3 days after our confrontation, I found myself back in the chemo ward, staring at my phone. Victor's response had finally arrived, not through his lawyer, but through the hospital administration. Mrs. Marlin, my regular nurse, approached cautiously. There seems to be an issue with your insurance coverage. Of course there was. I pulled up the email I'd received an hour ago. My treatment authorization had been revoked, Pending review. Sabrina's handiwork, no doubt. My phone buzzed with a text from Victor. Let's discuss terms. Before I could respond, Tessa burst into the ward, her face ashen. Mom, they're announcing it right now. She held up her tablet, showing a live press conference. Victor stood at a podium, Sabrina by his side, both wearing appropriately somber expressions. In light of my wife's declining health, Victor was saying, we're expediting the launch of our medical technology division. This personal tragedy has shown us the urgent need for better healthcare solutions. My hands started shaking as he continued. My wife's cognitive decline has unfortunately led to some concerning behavior. We're working with medical professionals to ensure she receives appropriate care. The bastard was using my illness to paint me as unstable. Any accusations I made now would look like the ravings of a sick woman. He's freezing your accounts, Tessa whispered. All of them. Even the ones we thought were secure. My chest tightened. We'd anticipated his moves, planned for his manipulation, but this was scorched earth tactics. Mrs. Marlin, the nurse touched my arm. Without insurance authorization, we can't continue today's treatment. I looked at my 4-line, already inserted but not yet connected to the medication that was keeping me alive. Victor had found my weakness, not my illness, but my need for treatment. He wants you to beg, Tessa said, gripping my hand. Don't give him that satisfaction. But it wasn't that simple. Without treatment, I'd have weeks, maybe months. All our evidence, all our careful planning, would mean nothing if I wasn't alive to see it through. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Sabrina. Victor's willing to be generous, given your condition. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, the ward too small. Patients around me continued their treatments, oblivious to the way my world was collapsing. Mom. Tessa's voice cracked. What do we do now? I watched a drop of saline fall from my disconnected 4-line, remembering something my first oncologist told me. Sometimes surviving means knowing when to retreat and regroup. Call Lyla, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Tell her to prepare the nuclear option. But that would mean... I know. I pulled out my 4-line. Sometimes you have to lose everything to win anything at all. The boardroom fell silent as I walked in, every executive's eye fixed on me. Victor stood at the head of the table, mid-presentation, his face freezing when he saw me. Sabrina, seated at his right, reached for her phone. Don't bother calling security, I said, setting down a thick folder. Your shareholders will want to hear this. Celeste, Victor's voice carried that familiar patronizing tone. You're not well. This isn't the place. Actually, it's exactly the place. I opened the folder, sliding copies down the table. Everything's here. The insider trading, the HIPAA violations, the fraudulent medical technology patents. One of the board members picked up a document, his eyes widening. These authorization codes were stolen from patient records, I finished. Specifically, from cancer patients whose treatment data was used to develop your new division's products. My records included. Sabrina stood up, smoothing her skirt. These are obviously fabricated. Mrs. Marlin's condition has affected her judgment. Funny you should mention judgment. Tessa's voice came from the doorway. She walked in with 2 men in suits. The SEC and HHS fraud division have some questions about yours. Victor's facade cracked. This is ridiculous. I built this company. On other people's suffering, I cut in, starting with mine. He lunged for the documents, but Lyla stepped forward from where she'd been waiting quietly in the corner. I wouldn't. Those are just copies. The originals are already being reviewed by federal investigators. The boardroom erupted in chaos. Executives whispered urgently. Papers shuffled. Phones emerged. Through it all, Victor stared at me, his expression shifting from anger to something else, fear. You'll destroy everything, he hissed. The company, our reputation. Your reputation, I corrected. I'm just a sick woman, remember? One whose cognitive decline you so publicly worried about. Understanding dawned in his eyes. By discrediting me, he'd given me the perfect cover to work unnoticed. Every move he'd made to isolate me had only made me more dangerous. The board will be taking a recess, the chairman announced, standing. Victor, stay here. Everyone else. Actually, one of the SEC agents interrupted. We need to speak with both Mr. Marlin and Miss Reynolds." As they led Victor and Sabrina away, he turned back to me. "How long?" he asked. "How long have you been planning this?" I thought of all the nights I'd spent alone during chemo, all the times he'd dismissed my concerns, all the years of subtle manipulation. "Since the day you taught me that love without respect isn't love at all." The door closed behind them, leaving me standing in the emptying boardroom, finally breathing freely. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying someone else, it's about reclaiming yourself. 6 months later, I sat on my front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of healing. My last scan had come back clear, though the word remission still felt fragile on my tongue. Like happiness, it was something I was learning to trust again. Tessa emerged from the house carrying 2 mugs of tea, settling into the chair beside me. "Mail came," she said, handing me an envelope. "It's from Dad's lawyer." The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, Victor's confession, part of his plea deal. I'd testified at his hearing last month, watching him trade his tailored suits for prison orange. Sabrina had turned state's evidence against him, proving that even the most carefully built facades eventually crumble. "Are you going to read it?" Tessa asked. I folded the letter, tucking it away. "Maybe someday. Right now, I'm more interested in living than reliving." She nodded, understanding as always. The foundation called again. "They want you to speak at their fundraiser for cancer patients facing insurance discrimination." The irony wasn't lost on me. Victor's attempt to weaponize my illness had led to a complete overhaul of the hospital's patient protection policies. Sometimes justice works in unexpected ways. My phone buzzed, Lyla, sending a link to a news article. Victor's company had been restructured, with a new board focusing on ethical medical research. My testimony hadn't just brought down Victor. It had forced an entire industry to examine its conscience. "Mom." Tessa's voice was quiet. "Do you ever regret not taking his first offer? The settlement would have been easier." I thought about it, watching a pair of birds build their nest in my new garden. Easier isn't always better. Sometimes you have to tear everything down to build something stronger. She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. Like us. Like us." Later that night, after Tessa had gone home, I finally opened Victor's letter. His familiar handwriting filled the page. I convinced myself I was protecting the company, our future. But the truth is, I was afraid. Not of losing money or power, but of watching you face death with more courage than I've shown in my entire life. You were never the weak one, Celeste. I was. I folded the letter and walked to my garden. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of blooming flowers, plants that had grown from the ashes of what I'd burned down. Sometimes revenge isn't about making someone suffer. Sometimes it's about proving them wrong in the most beautiful way possible, by thriving despite their best efforts to destroy you. I planted Victor's letter among my flowers. Let it decompose there, feeding new growth. After all, that's what healing really is, turning poison into medicine, pain into purpose, endings into beginnings.